Okay, so today we'll be having a look at cultural bias in psychology because it's mentioned on the specification, and of course because it's a fascinating area to consider as well because it's so sort of fully ingrained and all-encompassing within psychology. So if you just want to have a quick look at the specification, then you'll just see here, we've already looked at gender, you're now going to have a look at culture in psychology. Universality and bias kind of combined as one concept here. So you need to know about gender and culture in relation to bias and universality. And then particularly in cultural bias, you must know about ethnocentrism and cultural relativism and the term cultural bias itself because they're mentioned directly on the specification. So you could have a question that refers to give examples of or define or consider the key terms, so it makes direct reference to them. And there are a couple of other key terms that make your life just that bit easier when you're aware. There are no past or sample exam questions on this, totally new part of the specification. Previously, you were never going to be asked questions directly on cultural bias. You just had to write about topics of information, so essentially what you're covering with Andy, and you needed to be aware of the different issues and debates that were most relevant, and cultural bias was a really, really relevant one to almost every piece of research because everything is very culturally biased, mostly within psychology. Here's my quick guess at what 3 of the questions could be like, which is very, very similar to the gender bias as well. I'd encourage you to do the PowerPoint slide, have a look at the tasks on the last slide, and then have a go at answering these questions. And then there'll be a mark scheme video on the YouTube channel for you to check your information. What I'd really like to think that you would do is listen to the information, plan your answers, write your answers without too much reference to your notes, check them on the mark scheme, identify what you think your mark is, and how you could improve your answer, and finally then bring it to me. So essentially I'm marking your marking as opposed to your essays yourself, which is much more useful for you because it's developing that skill. Essentially you want to know exactly what the examiner's looking for. What's a better way of doing that than being the examiner yourself? We have cultural bias. This is all the AO1 information that you need to be aware of. 64% of psychologists are American, so not even considering ones from Europe or anywhere else. A certain period of time when this research was conducted, 64% of psychologists were American. So much like in gender bias, there was issues with the majority of the researchers, a significant psychologist, being male. The same focus is on American psychologists or Western psychologists, and you'll see there's a direct link, sort of. You could almost draw, I would say, for the way that I've presented it, you could draw a box for gender bias and put the information in, and you would have it comparable cultural bias information for the majority of it as well. And then 94%, so that was the percentage, the amount of when they analysed a textbook, like a key textbook within a psychology course, one of the things that they analysed was where the research had been conducted, and they found that 94% of the studies that were looked at in the key psychology were linked to America, or American psychologists were conducted in America. So obviously then the sample becomes quite focused as well. And very briefly, if we skip on to the next slide and then return back to this one, you'll see all the different rankings of the top universities. And if you have a look there, you've got every single one of them, all the locations. They are all from the United States or the United Kingdom. Okay, so hopefully you're all going to aim to go to the University of Cambridge, or perhaps a little bit further afield to somewhere in America, but hopefully that makes you realise how focused, if we're only teaching, if all the top psychology, much like all the top male psychologists were male, if the top universities for studying psychology are all from the UK or the United Kingdom or the United States, then it's going to be very culturally focused. So I thought that was quite interesting. There are some key terms or some key concepts. So you can use the terms alpha and beta bias if you want to in relation, and they mean exactly the same things, you just link them to cultural concepts instead. So we've got cultural bias here, which is just generalizing research, and then there's a couple of different ways you could do that, different examples you need to be aware of. So I would refer to your cat book or to the Green Haired Girl to get a direct definition of this, but it's just the idea that essentially it's kind of doing a variety of different things, but the key mistake that people make the most is generalizing research that's only been based on a certain culture, and usually that is because either the psychologist studying it comes from a certain culture and therefore is swayed culturally regardless of whether they're aware of it or not. So even if they're studying a different culture, they still might be applying their own cultural bias, or having, as you know, investigator effect, having an influence on the participants because of the understanding of the difference between cultures, whether they're aware of it or not, and then having the same sample as well. So a culturally biased sample, a sample that's generally ethno and the next term we're going to come on to, ethnocentric, so much like androcentric or male, this is ethnocentric, one particular focus on one particular culture. And then we'll go, right, yep, that's the research we found, that applies to absolutely everybody, we shall apply it to everyone. So not considering different cultures. And also, and again, we'll come across this concept later on with ethnocentrism, but the idea that our culture is the correct and the normal way to behave, and other cultures are abnormal if they don't behave that way. So again, it's not about just two cultural differences. It's about one culture being right and the other culture being wrong. And the perfect example of that would be Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you look at the different stages. So I'd refresh your memory on that and put that down, and kind of consider why that might be culturally biased. Have a look back at the evaluation points. So again, I'm referring to things that you're already aware of to kind of save you that time and that effort to finding out new information, reducing, condensing down your notes. But you need to be really, really clear about Maslow's hierarchy of need and why there's differences. So focusing on the difference between a collectivist and a culture and an individualistic culture, and which one Maslow's hierarchy is more appropriate for. So return to your revision notes and have a look at that. Ethnocentrism is exactly like androcentrism. It's the idea that focusing on the superiority of one's own culture, and generally it's Western cultures are considered the norm within psychology, because as you saw, there was that big long list. Everybody studied it from the United Kingdom or the USA. And 94%, probably, I think personally, might be higher by now, but of American psychologists, and then you factor in European psychologists, which have that Western influence as well. That's a huge amount of psychologists from America or from Western cultures. And then we have two constructs which are quite complex to follow. They come from anthropology, but we can apply them within here. It is mentioned in your CAT book on page 45 as an evaluation point. I don't use it like that because I think it's a little bit too, it's just not a strong evaluation point. However, they are really useful terms to be aware of. So there is emic constructs. That's the idea, the view that every single culture is unique, which technically sounds quite positive to start with. We generally study it from within, with immersing ourselves in the culture. However, the problem is that then we look at very sort of small significant pockets of culture, as opposed to being so it's very culturally specific. So this happens here and we can explain it because of this in this culture. But then if we look at the same behaviour or try and apply the same approach somewhere else, it's not possible. So emic construct, although starting to acknowledge that there is a difference between cultures, limits us on how much we can consider research that we look at. And then you've got an etic construct, so the idea that we're developing cross-cultural explanations, universal behaviours, and we do actively try and do that without any cultural bias, by remaining culturally neutral, because there are some universal behaviours, or the suggestion is there's some, and constantly there's research breaking those assumed universal behaviours down. But for example, they did find there were 7 different universal facial expressions. So there were lots of other ways of communicating using facial expressions that kind of were culturally specific, so certain facial expressions meant certain things. However, there were 7 key universal behaviours, and then that could link back to the evolutionary concept that there had to be, initially we all evolved from the same sort of area, so therefore we had the same sort of evolutionary pressures which influenced to develop certain universal behaviours. So I can't remember off the top of my head. I would encourage you to go and research them, and I'll try and remember to pop a link on at the end. Things like happy, sad, disgusted, scared, things that are probably quite useful because you want to be, regardless of who you are, you want to understand different facial expressions. So if somebody eats something disgusting and pulls a disgusted face, or sees something disgusting, you know to avoid that, not to be like, oh, I wonder what that is, I'll go and pick it up and play with it, as thinking about evolutionary approach so many, many thousands of years ago. So the etic construct, if used appropriately, it can be really, really effective. You just have to approach things very, very delicately. And then there's alpha bias. So that's where we consider, so it's almost like an imposed edict. So we think that we aren't identifying any differences. We're not kind of considering any differences between people. We are developing a universal behaviour, whereas actually that isn't the case. So we're overemphasising cultural differences. And this is where you can talk about attachment, and you know all the different types of attachment. You know about the cross-cultural issues within attachment. I'm just pausing here. All right, apologies about that. I had a quick look at my PowerPoint slides and I wasn't happy with the structuring of them. I think this is much clearer. So the way I would approach it, and have your understanding of emic and etic constructs, and then what you want to consider is the concept of imposed ethics. So something else you need to talk about. And attachment fits really nicely into the idea of imposed ethic, I would say, as opposed to where I had it before. You could also present attachments to the strange situation Mary Ainsworth as a really good example of kind of more general cultural bias. In fact, any of the examples that I use here can just come under the heading of cultural bias. So if you were asked to give examples of cultural bias in the exam, then all of the ones that I'm going to discuss below are really useful ones to consider. However, for the higher marks, you'd want to be filtering them into different pockets or bits of levels of understanding as well. Hence why it does mention on the final slides as tasks, one of the suggestions is to do a mind map, and I would encourage you to consider that because that's quite a useful way of structuring, identifying things, placing them into categories, but whatever works for you. So imposed etic, or etic, as I've spelled it there, that's not correct. So you want to be spelling it this way here. So imposed ethic is the idea that we apply our culture thinking that it is universal when actually that is not the case. So Mary Ainsworth believed that the attachment types were appropriate to apply across all cultures, and when she did her research, or when research was done, we found that that wasn't the case, and that once again, talking about ethnocentrism, we kind of considered ourselves superior to the most appropriate attachment type, and as you can imagine from the name gives it the clue, is secure attachment. And then clearly that wasn't the case, because what happened was we started to sort of consider ourselves as the epitome, the perfect example of attachment, and then other people, other cultures were inferior, whereas actually they were just different, as opposed to one was better than the other. But that's an imposed ethic. So secure attachment is the best one to be. These are the 3 attachment types. This is the way that you should raise a child, applying that. So these are universal attachment types that are appropriate for everybody, is what Ainsworth believed, but actually it was just an imposed ethics of the idea. So actually that wasn't the case, that they weren't universal, and there needed to be some acknowledgement of cross-cultural considerations. You could talk about Takahashi, or any of the, I think it's Isambard and Kronenberg that you look at with Andy on that. And then we've got the idea of alpha and beta bias. So alpha bias is over-exaggerating, and that's different. Over-exaggerating the differences and generally considering your own one superior. So, and there's the piece of research which is quite interesting about from Takano and Oscar, which is in the CAT book as well on page 44, and they did a study. So generally what you would expect is there to be significant differences between collectivist and individualistic cultures, and there's a link at the end of the PowerPoint slide about that as well, so you can do a little bit more reading. And you'd expect, and it's kind of looking at what we'd expect from conformity. So you'd expect individual cultures to be less conforming because they're less kind of focused on working as a group. And they reviewed these 15 studies that found that 14 of them went against that concept. So we over-exaggerated the idea that there should be differences between individualistic and collectivist cultures within conformity when there isn't. You could also talk about that with attachment as well. So the idea that one of the pieces of research Andy used to talk about, whether he still does now, is that there's actually more variation within cultures. So there's more difference in attachment and child raising behaviours within cultures than there is between cultures. So again, that's something else that you could consider. We're overemphasising those differences. this should be different to this culture is different to this culture, whereas actually that's not the case. And then beta bias is where we minimise or completely ignore individual differences, cultural differences, and that is a significant problem as well. There was a huge scandal around IQ. So they conducted a piece of research, and I'll have some examples of IQ tests that kind of demonstrate this. So they thought that the IQ test they developed, they didn't even really think about culture, presumably, but they considered this to be the right way. You should know all of this information, and actually the original kind of, and still today, IQ tests test not necessarily intelligence. There's a lot of arguments that they test essentially cultural knowledge. So there were questions in the original one about who advertised this certain brand of chocolate, which of course was only in America. So that wasn't about testing how intelligent somebody was. That was obviously testing memory, but it was also testing that cultural knowledge, because that advert might not be available in other countries. It doesn't mean they're not intelligent, just means that they don't use the same kind of advertising. From this, they consistently found that people not from Western cultures, so with the focus in the 1920s being more on black people, they consistently found that people with black people had a lower IQ than traditionally Western kind of white people did, and that caused a huge kind of uproar. It was, and we could talk about this in the evaluation points, the idea that it suggested that black people were less intelligent, and kind of allowed people who discriminated against them, that kind of gave them that justification as well. And so that's an example of completely ignoring that there are any cultural differences between the two, and considering that maybe we need to be more culturally considerate, especially when we develop things that we claim can be universal but they are not, such as IQ tests. And also in the ICD, which isn't something we look at, which is like the European version of the DSM, so the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. They have a section that acknowledges that if you're, or kind of like a caveat that you read that acknowledges that if you are studying something from a different culture, talking with somebody, having a clinical interview with somebody from a different culture, that these are things you need to consider, and you need to ask your questions slightly differently, all of those different things, which leads us quite nicely onto the definitions of abnormality, which a lot of, as you can remember, and I'd highly encourage you now to do some research on, to revision and refresh your memory of those. They experience a lot of problems with cultural relativism, which I need to add onto the slide as well. I'll pop that on in a minute. Cultural relativism, so the idea that, for the example, I think that they give in the book is linked to the statistical infrequencies, and we look at the different ones, and it talks about schizophrenia and claiming to hear voices. And as we discussed last year, it's the idea that behaviours that are considered abnormal within certain cultures, particularly Western ones, lead to people receiving a diagnosis of mental health needs when actually that isn't appropriate at the time. So for example, schizophrenia and hearing voices, obviously within a traditionally Western culture, is quite an unusual thing to do, and is a sign of mental health needs. However, in other cultures, say Eastern cultures, they do say that hearing voices, they believe that the ancestors are guiding and supporting you. So there's the idea that, and there's loads of different kind of understandings of it within different cultures, and I'd encourage you to research and find one example that you find particularly useful. That hearing voices is kind of support from their relatives that have died. So if I came as a Western person and said, I'm hearing the voice of my dead grandfather, then that'd be quite concerning. However, in certain cultures, to hear the voices of your past ancestors is considered a blessing and an honour as well. So it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate to diagnose that person with mental health conditions, because that might not be the case. And then the same, kind of slightly inspired by the image at the top, is the suggestion that going topless in certain cultures, that sort of, if you're just walking down the street topless, if you're a woman, then that is considered inappropriate with certain cultures, particularly within the UK and other ones as well. However, if you see below, there's somebody called Mead, which is a piece of research which is very, very interesting. And she, and if you watch the video on the final slide, you'll see the traditional kind of dress of the Papua New Guinea people is to is so that women are topless as well as men, which wouldn't be considered an abnormal um, behaviour at that time. So it's about considering different cultures, and if we completely ignore that there's differences between cultures, then we can experience problems as well. So the definitions of abnormality ignore that two cultures might have different ways of behaving, and so you might define somebody as having a mental health need that doesn't because of the cultural difference. Um, so there we go. I've just added onto the slide there the key term that went along with the definition. So you've got cultural relativism, the idea that you want to acknowledge that all cultures are worthy of study and respect. So the total opposite of ethnocentrism, that we should consider all cultures, as different and unique and worthy of study and consideration. But we need to, and this is where it links into universality. It's developing those universal theories that do still allow for and acknowledge that there are cultural differences, but aren't so rigid that it's only cultural different that we only consider people from Germany as doing this, and so on and so on. We've got to acknowledge individual cultural differences as well. And obviously there aren't any examples of that, because that's the ideal we're aiming for. And currently, as far as I'm aware, although if you want to go away and do some research, I'd be very grateful to hear of any studies, theories that you think fit with that concept of universality. And then we've got Mead underneath, so as an example of when we study too many, we can sort of, almost one of the dangers of cultural relativism. Generally it's a really positive thing and quite encouraged, but Mead focused very, very much on Papua New Guinea and the idea that the people were all very, very different. And there's a link to a really interesting documentary at the end, which is 6 short videos that all make up one whole documentary. And she said that they were very different, and she ignored that actually, or didn't notice in fact, that there were some universal behaviours that were similar. So they found that so she overemphasised the differences. It's alpha bias, and actually consistently there was the universal difference that men were more aggressive than the women. And that is in your cat book as well, and also in the green-haired girl, I think, and quite an interesting one to have a look at and be able to explain in a bit more detail. So what I'd encourage that you do is have a look, create, now put available on Moodle, have a table with all of the different approaches, and consider, and here they've combined gender and cultural bias, which is probably quite a useful one, because the questions could be combined together. So identify issues with gender bias and cultural bias within psychology, but even if they're not, you've got them nice and combined. So there's lots of different things that you can talk about for each one of those, whether they are or aren't gender bias and cultural bias, and what kind of issues that might raise. And then exactly the same, and I'll make this one available on Moodle for you as well. Look at each topic from last year and consider gender and cultural biases that are raised. And then what I would seriously encourage you to do, which is a much simpler and smaller task, but much quicker, is consider, because it has, when we discussed it in the previous slides, and if you think about the information in the books as well, it's all been a little bit separate and not combined, is consider each one of those terms. So cultural bias, emic and etic constructs, alpha bias, beta bias, and cultural relativism, alpha and beta bias being linked to cultural bias this time. Give examples of, or one or two examples of each one. Ideally, you want to steal them from previous research in previous areas, but also there may be some new ones. And again, the Cat and the Dog book is really, really useful for that. And then you want to be able to explain why they are examples of each one of these terms as well. But I think that's an extremely significant and very, very helpful task. If you're going to start with any task, that is the one that I would go for. And then a quick run through of the evaluation points, so the AO3, which would be more important. So thinking about the discussed question, you'd want to be going for 3 or 4 evaluation points. And I have structured these exactly the same way as gender. So you should be able to combine the two. So if they were combined, you would say, well, one of the problems with gender and cultural bias is the creation and the kind of continuation of negative stereotypes, and then explain why that's a bad thing, etc. So using the Peel structure. The bit in the middle, the example, you would just extend from, you'd give one gender bias example and you'd give one cultural bias example and combine them together. So I've tried to make it as easy as possible for you. Hopefully it supports your memory as well, because you've only got to remember triggers for one set of evaluation points, and then that should lead you on to both cultural and gender bias. So negative, exactly as I've said, the continuation and or the development of negative stereotypes. The focus there being on IQ tests that we spoke about in the last couple of slides. The idea that they generally found using IQ tests that black people were less intelligent than white people. And of course, that's extremely damaging and quite dangerous stereotype. And stereotypes can have a significant impact on people, the quality of people's lives. The other problem that cultural bias has is flawed research. So the idea that there's somebody who is from America, who is male, who is a student, so a very, very particular type of culture, is 4,000 times more likely to be asked to take part in psychological research than someone who is non-Western and has no links to, isn't a student, or I think the term that they use in the book is random, which perhaps isn't ideal, but it's the basic idea. So you're 4,000 times more likely to be in a piece of research if you're from this certain, generally white, generally male, student, Western kind of culture. So that's a big issue in itself, the research. And then what you want to kind of take on from there is it also then leads on to very, very biased theories, which are a bit of a problem. And then you could talk about Maslow's hierarchy of need being quite biased. You could talk about Ainsworth's research being quite biased. Anything in there that you think can kind of link with those concepts. You could talk about the idea of everything like memory very much uses all of those sort of particular types of cultures and why that might be a problem as well. So while we focused on culture being a difference between Western and non-Western, or white and non-white, ethnic minorities, he can also talk about subcultures. So the fact that we focus on very, very particular cultures, even within our American or European culture. So they're the weaknesses, the problems that we don't want. And then we've got reducing cultural bias. So a positive of cultural bias and acknowledging it, much like gender biases, we then actively work towards reducing it. The cultural kind of equivalent of feminist psychology is indigenous psychologies. And that thing really, really encourages to reconsider things. Bear in mind that actually a lot of the previous research has been quite culturally biased because of the people that it has been the research and the theories have been conducted and developed using there. So you've got, and then they've suggested the idea of Afrocentrism. So the suggestion is that everybody who is Afro-Caribbean, who's black, has their roots, their traditional roots within Africa. They came from Africa. So European values are inappropriate to apply to anybody who is black, or in fact you could even argue lots of other different cultures as well, because we all evolved from particular places. I think it's the savannah within Africa, that is where the human race kind of came from originally. So it's more appropriate to apply those theories, they're saying, or at least consider carefully who we are applying the European values to. And you want to talk about that, so that's positive because it allows us to consider research in a different manner and trying to remove that cultural bias, therefore making our research more generalisable, more valid. However, it does lead more to an emetic approach, which is very culturally specific, and therefore we can only focus on certain cultures. And sometimes we may look at behaviours in isolation, so then if we can't develop universal kind of unified theories, how much use is that? Next, we look at, and then finally, the key other thing that it does, acknowledging that research is culturally biased, we then have to develop effective ethic research. So we have to think carefully about the research that we conduct and then ensure that our research is more appropriate, more culturally appropriate. But also alongside that, then that would hopefully improve the generalizability of it more, in general, the validity more, etc., etc. So kind of expand it out. So just because we're considering cultures, it doesn't mean the only way it's improved is it's culturally significant now, but also that it's scientifically better and more improved. There's lots of detail about bus. Again, if you did relationships, I don't think you did, unfortunately, with Andy, but not that it's as interesting as it sounds. But bus is mentioned on there as being held up and revered as a particularly significant and appropriate example of research. I'm just having a quick look which book it was in. I definitely took it out of one of the two books. I think it would probably be the cat book. Yes, it was the cat book. On page 45, we looked at Buss and his 3 translators. So they had 3 different ways. He conducted cross-cultural research, which was really, really effective in considering it helped us identify sort of cultural differences in relationships, but also sort of universally significant things. And we found some things that perhaps clash slightly with the concept of gender bias. So the fact that men consistently look for women that are younger than them, women consistently look for men with more resources, linking back to the evolutionary approach. And he had the 3 translators that was really effective. So somebody who translated the questions into the person's native language, someone else who translated the answers back from their native language into the language that I assume was English that we were using, and then there was a 3rd translator who kind of picked apart any problems or inaccuracies and encouraged that consideration of the wider sort of meaning of the language almost. So it's extremely effective and kind of detailed research there. And not only did it increase the sort of the cultural appropriateness, as we said before, but also increasing sight. Well, there's 3 people who'd have to agree on something, so there would be we could look at inter-rater reliability. There was 3 people, so it removes kind of any investigator bias. We had 1 person particularly looking at extraneous variables, maybe, or sort of misunderstandings, so that kind of was caught and reduced. So it really, really improves the general validity of our research as well, which is always what we're looking for. So for evaluation points, negative stereotypes it allowed negative stereotypes to perpetuate, and it sort of gave us flawed research initially. However, by responding to cultural bias, we developed a whole new area of psychology, which allows to expand our knowledge, indigenous psychologies, and also it's allowed us to increase the effectiveness of our research. Okay, there's a list of different tasks that I'd encourage you to do. I would highly encourage you with this one to consider going back to your 1st and your 2nd year topics that you've previously looked at and used it as a way of revising information as well, and kind of the more that you categorise things, the more you place things into categories, the more it helps you understand. So kind of can you think about ones that particularly demonstrate cultural bias, maybe ones that we can't really comment on, and ones at the other side that don't raise necessarily so many cultural issues. Create your key terms, the ones that were on the board, do some way, create a glossary, create flashcards, do a Kahoots, a matching activity, create questions, get someone to test them on you, whatever it may be that you need to do that you find more effective. Please do not just think, the amount of conversations I've had recently with students, please do not just think that you can just look at the information, put it away and go, yeah, I understand it. I do that all the time. I read something, yeah, I think, yep, that makes perfect sense, put it away, and then I go, oh, no, can't explain that, I haven't really got a clue. If someone asks me a question, it's exactly the same thing with the exam questions, with the exam, okay? You think you understand it, you put it away, and then regularly I see students going, no, I don't have a clue. So test yourself in some way, think about how can you not just have the information there, even if it's as simple as create a mind map, put it to one side, using your notes, make it really detailed, put it to one side, try to recreate the mind map, and then different colours. You think, oh, look, compare the 2. Oh no, I missed this out, this out, this out. Put that mind map away. You then have the mind map you have just created with, oh yes, I need to revise this more, this more, and this more. So it's very, very visually obvious. Then plan the answers, write them using the YouTube channel. So I'll put on there information about the mark scheme and how you would go about answering those questions, and then identify strengths and areas for development. Why didn't you give yourself full marks, or if you did, why did you, so that we can sort of break down whether that was the right choice or not. Fingers crossed it is. And then discuss it and mark it with your tutor. Please don't come to me without having first done that, particularly identifying your areas for development. There is no point in you wouldn't want somebody to mark something and just give you a mark at the end. Don't do that to yourself. Kind of consider how you can improve. Create revision resources later to the exam, so essay plans, so you could have a little booklet with all your with the headings for the big essays and bullet pointed essay plans, or again even more effectively have the essay question on one side, the bullet pointed plan on the other, so you can test your knowledge. And then also I would encourage you to create a visual resource as well that identifies all the culturally biased and non-biased research, and then read the additional resources. So there might be some more by the time you go on Moodle to look at, but there's the tutor to you links which are always useful, and there is the link to the YouTube documentary that we spoke about with Mead as well, which is really, really interesting and kind of allows you to widen your knowledge and your understanding.